My niece snatched my necklace right off my neck at family dinner laughing, as the gold chain snapped and the heavy green gem hit my porcelain plate. She proudly announced that her mother told her it was just cheap online trash from a flea market, and that my fake jewelry was ruining the aesthetic of their perfect holiday table. My brother-in-law smirked and told me to stop overreacting over a worthless trinket. My parents just laughed along with them and ordered me into the kitchen to wash the dishes like a servant. I did not argue with any of them. I just smiled, picked up my broken Cartier necklace, walked straight to my car, and permanently canceled her $79,000 dance academy tuition. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who constantly underestimated your worth. My name is Nadia, and I am 32 years old. Growing up in our affluent Atlanta neighborhood, my family always made sure I knew my exact place at the bottom of the hierarchy. Our sprawling brick home with its perfectly manicured lawn and grand columns was essentially a stage built entirely for my older sister Vanessa. She was the absolute golden child of the family. I was just the dark cloud they merely tolerated because of shared DNA. That Thanksgiving evening was supposed to be a quiet holiday dinner, but in my family nothing is ever truly quiet. We were seated around the massive mahogany dining table that my parents Calvin and Brenda polished religiously. The smell of roasted turkey and sweet potato pie filled the room, mixing with the expensive perfume Vanessa always wore too much of. I was sitting quietly minding my own business and eating my meal when my 14-year-old niece Lila reached her hand suddenly across the table. Her manicured fingers clamped aggressively around the delicate gold chain resting on my collarbone, and she yanked it downward with surprising force. The heavy snap of solid gold breaking echoed in the suddenly silent dining room. My breath caught in my throat as the large emerald gem hit my porcelain dinner plate with a loud, sharp clack. I stared down at the heavy green stone sitting right next to my cranberry sauce. Before I could even process the physical sting on my neck or the shock of what had just happened, Lila rolled her eyes and crossed her arms over her chest. "Mom says it is just a fake you bought online anyway," she said loudly. Her voice carried that nasty, dripping entitlement she had learned directly from observing her mother for 14 years. "You are ruining the aesthetic of our holiday photos with that cheap trash from the flea market." I looked up at Vanessa. My older sister sat perfectly poised in her designer silk blouse, swirling her wine glass with a deeply satisfied smirk painted on her face. She did not correct her daughter or offer any form of apology. She simply took a slow sip of her Pinot Noir and looked away. "Lila, that is entirely unacceptable," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and level. "You need to apologize to me right now." Before the teenager could even open her mouth to respond, my brother-in-law Trent leaned over the table. Trent is a tall white man who runs a boutique consulting firm that supposedly makes millions. My parents absolutely adore him because he fits their exact image of high society success and pedigree. "Calm down, Nadia," Trent said, using that incredibly patronizing tone he always reserved just for me. "It is just a flea market trinket. Do not take your insecurities out on the kid just because you are embarrassed about your outfit. We all know your little admin salary cannot afford the real deal anyway." I looked toward the head of the table, fully expecting my parents to finally step in and discipline their grandchild. Instead, my father Calvin just chuckled softly. My mother Brenda actually laughed out loud, waving her manicured hand at me as if swatting away an annoying fly. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Nadia," my mother scolded harshly. "It is a holiday, and we are supposed to be happy. Do not ruin the mood over some cheap costume jewelry. Go into the kitchen and start washing the dishes right now. Trent has some very important corporate investors coming over for dessert later, and we need this table completely cleared and spotless. Go on now, move." I sat there looking at the four of them in total silence. For 32 years, this had been my exact reality. When I earned a full academic scholarship to study finance, They said I was wasting my time by not doing pre-med like Vanessa. When I landed my first corporate job, they told all their country club friends I was just a secretary fetching coffee. They had absolutely no idea that I was actually a senior vice president at one of the largest venture capital firms in the Southeast. They had no idea that the necklace Lila just broke was a limited edition Cartier piece worth $120,000. And they certainly had no idea that I was the only reason Lila could afford her prestigious arts education. I did not scream or throw a fit. I simply picked up the emerald, wiped the food off the gold setting, and dropped it into my purse. I stood up without a single word, grabbed my coat, and walked right out the front door. The crisp November air hit my face as I got into my car. I pulled out my phone and opened my secure banking application. With 3 quick taps, I logged into my private wealth accounts. I navigated to the recurring wire transfers and found the active authorization for the Royal Atlanta Dance Academy. Vanessa had cried to me 6 months ago, claiming she and Trent were temporarily illiquid and begging me to quietly cover the massive tuition bill. I pressed cancel. The screen flashed a red warning asking if I wanted to permanently revoke the $79,000 funding. I hit confirm, put my car in drive, and smiled into the rearview mirror. The games had officially begun. By Monday morning, the plush carpet of my corner office in Buckhead felt like an entirely different universe from my parents' dining room. Sitting behind my solid oak desk wrapped in a tailored navy suit, I looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Atlanta skyline. This was my world. A world where I made decisions that moved millions of dollars before most people had finished their morning coffee. My family still believed I was a struggling administrative assistant fighting to pay rent. They had absolutely no idea that I was the senior vice president of one of the most ruthless venture capital firms in the Southeast. I liked keeping them in the dark. It made their arrogance so much easier to dismantle. My personal cell phone vibrated against the polished wood of my desk. The screen illuminated with Vanessa's name. I let it vibrate 3 times, taking a slow sip of my black coffee before calmly pressing the answer button. I did not even get a chance to say hello before my sister's shrill voice completely shattered the quiet elegance of my office. "Nadia, what is wrong with your bank account?" Vanessa was practically screaming, her breath hitching with genuine hysteria. "I am standing in the lobby of the Royal Atlanta Dance Academy, and they just humiliated my daughter." The director pulled Lila out of her elite rehearsal in front of all the other mothers. They told her to pack up her dance bag and leave because the tuition wire bounced. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. I could perfectly picture Vanessa pacing the marble lobby of the dance academy, clutching her designer handbag, while the other wealthy Atlanta housewives whispered behind her back. "The wire did not bounce, Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "I canceled it." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. For a second, my sister was entirely speechless. When she finally found her voice, it was trembling with a toxic mixture of rage and pure entitlement. "You did what?" "Nadia, you listen to me right now. You are going to call your bank and fix this pathetic little error immediately. Lila has her winter showcase next month, and she is the lead soloist. Trent and I are dealing with some temporary liquidity issues with his consulting firm, and you promised to handle this until his next big client pays out. You need to wire that $79,000 right this second. And since you just put my poor child through severe emotional trauma, you are going to add an extra $2,000 to cover her custom recital dress as an apology." The sheer audacity of her demand was almost impressive. She genuinely believed I existed solely to fund the illusion of her perfect life, while she and her husband openly mocked me at family dinners. I took another sip of my coffee. The warm liquid felt grounding against the cold reality of my family dynamics. "I am not fixing anything, Vanessa," I replied, my tone steady and completely unbothered. "Fake jewelry wearers simply cannot afford to fund child prodigies. Go ask your highly successful husband to pay for his own daughter's hobbies." I pressed the red button to end the call before she could scream another word. The silence returned to my office, but I knew it would not last long. In my family, the golden child never fights her own battles when she can weaponize our parents to do it for her. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I placed the phone on my desk and tapped the speaker icon, letting Brenda's voice fill the large room. Nadia Marie Wilson. My mother shrieked, her voice vibrating with a familiar brand of venom. How dare you treat your sister this way? What is wrong with you? You are a bitter, jealous spinster, and you are actively trying to destroy your own niece's future just out of pure spite. I stared at my dual computer monitors, watching the real-time stock tickers flash green and red. I did not interrupt her. I knew the script by heart. Just because you cannot find a man and have a family of your own does not give you the right to punish Vanessa. My mother continued her words, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. Trent is a brilliant provider. He is just going through a brief transitional phase with his business. You should be honored to help support your niece instead of hoarding your little administrative paychecks. You need to wire that money right now, or you are no longer welcome in my home. While my mother kept ranting about Trent's supposed brilliance, an automated notification chimed softly from my secure internal network. A high-priority flag had just popped up on my risk assessment dashboard. Our venture capital firm specialized in distressed asset buyouts and emergency corporate loans. My team processed applications from failing businesses desperate for a financial lifeline. I casually clicked on the notification, letting my mother's insults fade into white noise. The file that opened on my screen made my heart skip a single beat. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the text with my eyes to make sure I was reading it correctly. The application was for an emergency commercial bailout loan in the amount of $5 million. The applicant was a boutique consulting agency, the exact same consulting agency owned and operated by my arrogant brother-in-law, Trent. The man who just 2 nights ago told me my salary was pathetic was now secretly begging my firm to save him from total bankruptcy. My mother was still yelling through the speakerphone, calling me a failure and a disappointment. I muted my side of the call so she could not hear the rapid clicking of my keyboard. I used my executive clearance to bypass the standard queue and pull up the full details of Trent's loan application. I needed to see exactly how deep of a hole the golden child's husband had dug for himself. The financial disclosures attached to the file were absolutely staggering. Trent had lied to everyone. His business was not just going through a transitional phase, it was a completely hollow shell. He had millions in unsecured debts, defaulted vendor payments, and commercial rent arrears. But that was not the detail that made me stop breathing. I scrolled down to the collateral section of the application. In order to secure a $5 million high-risk loan, Trent needed to pledge tangible assets of equal or greater value. I stared at the property address listed on the digital document. My blood ran completely cold before a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. Trent had not listed his own home or his luxury cars. The collateral he had secretly pledged to secure his desperate $5 million lifeline was a sprawling premium estate in Buckhead. It was the exact address of my parents' fully paid-off retirement home. I unmuted my phone just as my mother paused to take a breath. "Are you even listening to me, Nadia?" she demanded, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "I am listening perfectly, Mom," I said, staring at the document that proved her perfect son-in-law was about to leave her completely homeless. "I will talk to you soon." I ended the call and downloaded Trent's entire financial file directly to my secure private drive. My family wanted to treat me like a worthless outsider while worshiping a man who was actively robbing them blind. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of his wealth and the mockery of my supposed poverty. Now I held the absolute power to dismantle their entire world with a single signature. I stared at the glowing screen of my monitor, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Trent had listed my parents' fully paid-off retirement estate as collateral for a $5 million distressed asset loan. I bypassed the standard review queue and used my senior executive clearance to pull the full financial history of his boutique consulting firm. What I found was an absolute masterpiece of financial deception. Trent was not a brilliant businessman or a visionary entrepreneur. He was a con artist running a glorified Ponzi scheme. I dug through hundreds of pages of banking records, corporate filings, and tax documents, discovering a massive web of wire fraud and unpaid luxury leases. His shiny Mercedes, his expensive country club fees, and even Vanessa and her designer wardrobe were all financed through a network of shady shell companies and predatory debt. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, and now he was trying to rob my own parents just to save himself. The $5 million was not for a business expansion like he claimed on the application. It was a desperate attempt to pay off aggressive creditors who were rapidly closing in on him. If his firm defaulted on this massive loan, the bank would seize my parents' house, immediately leaving them completely homeless and destitute in their old age. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting on a financial landmine built by the son-in-law they worshipped. I spent the next hour systematically downloading every fraudulent document, every bounced check, and every defaulted contract into a secure encrypted file on my private server. I was still processing the sheer magnitude of Trent's deception when I pulled into the parking garage of my apartment complex later that evening. The concrete structure was quiet and empty. As I walked toward the elevator, I saw two familiar figures standing in the dimly lit lobby. My parents, Calvin and Brenda, had somehow bypassed the security gate and were waiting for me. They did not look like people whose daughter had just been publicly humiliated by their grandchild at a holiday dinner. They looked furious, impatient, and completely entitled. I stopped a few feet away from them, bracing myself for whatever delusional demand was about to come out of their mouths. My father did not even bother with a standard greeting or ask how my day was. He stepped forward aggressively and shoved a thick manila folder directly into my chest. "Open it and sign the highlighted pages right now," he ordered, his voice echoing harshly against the concrete walls. I looked down at the heavy stack of documents. It was a legal release form for my late grandmother's generational trust fund. My grandmother had left the trust to be divided equally between Vanessa and me. I had left my half untouched, letting the interest grow quietly, while Vanessa had already blown through most of hers trying to keep up appearances. "Your sister needs to purchase a new vacation home in Aspen to host Trent's important corporate clients," my mother chimed in, crossing her arms over her chest. "She is temporarily short on liquid cash, and you are hoarding your half of the trust for absolutely no reason. You have no family and no real responsibilities to worry about. It is only fair that you sign your 50% over to Vanessa so she can maintain her social standing." I stared at them in pure disbelief. They were not just asking me to fund my abuser's lavish lifestyle. They were demanding I surrender my only inheritance to finance a fake vacation home for a man who was actively trying to steal their actual home. When I did not immediately take the pen my father offered, his face flushed with deep anger. "Listen to me very carefully, Nadia," he growled, stepping so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You have been nothing but a bitter, jealous disappointment to this family from the very beginning. If you refuse to sign this release and support the successful side of this family, I will disown you right here and now. You will no longer be my daughter. You will be completely dead to us." The threat hung heavy in the damp air of the parking garage. For 32 years, the thought of losing my parents' approval had terrified me to my core. I had twisted myself into knots trying to earn a single word of praise from a father who saw me only as a failure and a mother who viewed me as an inconvenience. But standing there, looking at their greedy, expectant faces, I realized I had absolutely nothing left to lose because I had never truly had their love to begin with. I reached into my leather briefcase, but I did not pull out the cheap pen my father was holding out to me. I pulled out my own sleek fountain pen and a single sheet of heavy corporate letterhead. I looked at my parents and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I smiled because they had no idea that I held the keys to their entire existence. I placed my document over their trust release form, pressing it against the hood of my car. I did not sign away my inheritance to fund my sister's delusions. Instead, I signed my name with smooth, deliberate strokes at the bottom of a highly classified executive authorization form. I used my full title, Senior Vice President of Acquisitions. With that single signature, I authorized my venture capital firm to aggressively buy out all of Trent's outstanding debt from his current angry creditors. I did not just reject their ridiculous demand, I legally became Trent's primary creditor. I capped my pen, handed their unsigned trust documents back to my father, and walked past them to the elevator. I was now the absolute owner of every single thing my arrogant brother-in-law possessed, and his ultimate nightmare was just beginning. I pressed the elevator button and watched the doors slide shut on my parents' stunned faces. They thought they were the ones in control, but I had just bought the entire game. The very next evening, my phone buzzed relentlessly with demands from my mother. It was the night of the Atlanta Business Excellence Gala, and attendance was absolutely mandatory. My mother texted me strict instructions to wear something subdued and to arrive early because Vanessa needed help managing her evening. I decided to play along. I wore a simple black sheath dress and took an Uber to the Grand Ballroom downtown, leaving my tailored executive suit safely tucked away in my closet. When I arrived, the ballroom was already glittering with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with Atlanta's elite. Vanessa spotted me immediately. She was draped in a sequined gown that I now knew was financed by predatory credit lines. Before I could even say hello, she shoved her heavy velvet coat into my arms and snapped her fingers, pointing toward the open bar. "Be a dear and fetch me a vodka soda, Nadia," she said, not even looking at me. "And make sure they use the top shelf liquor." Trent is about to receive the Entrepreneur of the Year award, and my nerves are just shot from all this high society pressure. I stood there holding her coat like a hired coat check attendant. I watched as she glided back to Trent, who was standing in a circle of local business owners, projecting the image of a wildly successful mastermind. I knew the truth. I had seen the receipts. Trent had practically purchased this award through a series of expensive sponsorships his failing company could not actually afford. He was standing there soaking up the admiration of my parents while drowning in millions of dollars of hidden debt that I now legally owned. I walked to the bar and ordered her drink, my face a mask of calm indifference. When I returned and handed Vanessa the glass, my father Calvin pulled me aside. His voice was low and stern, a harsh contrast to the beaming smile he wore for the cameras. "Do not do anything to embarrass your brother-in-law tonight, Nadia," my father warned, gripping my arm a little too tightly. "This is a monumental achievement for our family. Trent is elevating all of us. Try to learn something from him instead of sulking in the corner." I nodded mutely. The sheer irony of my father lecturing his black daughter about success while worshipping a white con artist who had just mortgaged his entire retirement was almost too bitter to swallow. A few minutes later, the lights dimmed and a spotlight hit the main stage. The room fell silent as the presenter announced the keynote award. Trent walked up to the podium, adjusting his expensive tuxedo jacket and flashing a brilliant practice smile. The applause was deafening, especially from my parents' table. Trent leaned into the microphone. He talked about vision and risk and the heavy burden of being a true innovator. Then his eyes scanned the crowd and locked directly onto me, standing in the back holding his wife's coat. His smile turned into a sharp, condescending smirk. "Of course, true visionaries face a lot of obstacles," he said, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "We constantly have to deal with bitter, single corporate drones who lack the courage to build their own empires. You know the type. Middle management types who sit in their cubicles pushing paper and harboring resentment for those of us who actually create wealth." Laughter rippled through the room. I watched my father Calvin chuckle loudly, clapping his hands in agreement. My own father was validating the public humiliation of his daughter, eagerly participating in a misogynistic joke just to appease his fraudulent son-in-law. He looked at Trent with such absolute adoration while I stood there, bearing the weight of their collective disrespect. I did not react. I did not drop the coat or storm out in tears. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the main ballroom, slipping into the quiet, heavily carpeted corridor that led to the VIP restrooms. I needed a moment away from the suffocating hypocrisy of my family. The hallway was empty, the thick doors blocking out the sound of the ongoing applause. As I approached the corner near the men's lounge, I heard a familiar voice echoing from an alcove. It was Trent. He was pacing back and forth, his tone completely different from the smooth, confident speaker on stage just moments ago. He sounded frantic, desperate, and out of breath. I pressed myself against the patterned wallpaper, sliding closer to the edge of the wall to listen. "Sarah, I told you to stop calling my primary number," Trent hissed into what looked like a cheap burner phone. "I am at the gala right now. Listen to me carefully. The plan is still on. I am liquidating Calvin and Brenda's entire retirement portfolio by Friday morning. The paperwork is already filed. My blood ran ice cold. I held my breath, terrified that even the sound of my heart beating would give me away. No, Vanessa suspects absolutely nothing." Trent continued, letting out a cruel laugh. "She is too busy taking selfies with her fake friends. I have the offshore accounts completely set up and ready to receive the wire transfers. Once the money clears, we are taking the private charter to the Cayman Islands just like we planned. I will be out of this miserable city and away from these pathetic, gullible people before they even realize their bank accounts are completely empty. Just pack your bags and wait for my signal." I stood frozen against the wall, processing the sheer magnitude of the evil I was witnessing. Trent was not just trying to save his failing business. He was planning to completely wipe out my parents' life savings, abandon my sister, and flee the country with his mistress. Without making a single sound, I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out my phone. I opened the voice memo application and hit the red record button, holding it out slightly to catch the last few seconds of his treacherous conversation. "I will see you on Friday," Sarah Trent murmured, his voice dripping with affection. "We are going to be rich." He ended the call and let out a heavy sigh of relief. I quickly stopped the recording and slipped my phone back into my purse. A cold, ruthless energy settled over my entire body. Trent thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted a family he viewed as nothing more than an easy payday. But he had no idea that the bitter corporate drone he had just mocked on stage was already 10 steps ahead, holding the absolute power to crush him into dust. I stepped out of the shadows of the alcove just as Trent shoved his cheap burner phone back into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket. The heavy plush carpet muffled my footsteps, but he must have sensed my presence because he spun around instantly. The smug, victorious look on his face completely vanished when he saw me standing there. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine panic flash in his pale blue eyes. He knew I had heard every single word of his treacherous plan. But Trent was a master manipulator, and he quickly recovered his arrogant composure. He took 2 large, aggressive steps toward me, closing the distance between us, until he was invading my personal space. The scent of expensive cologne and stale scotch washed over me, making my stomach churn. He did not look like the charismatic award winner anymore. He looked like a cornered animal ready to strike. "What are you creeping around in the dark for, Nadia?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Did you get lost looking for the coat check?" I did not flinch or step back. I looked him dead in the eye and let a cold, knowing smile touch my lips. "I am just enjoying the show, Trent," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even. "It is truly fascinating to watch a man plan his own getaway to the Cayman Islands while his gullible wife is out there fetching him top-shelf drinks. Sarah must be a very special woman to make you abandon your entire fraudulent empire." His face turned a mottled shade of angry red. The charming facade he wore for my family completely melted away, revealing the ruthless predator underneath. He lunged forward and shoved me hard against the textured wallpaper of the corridor. His heavy forearm pressed forcefully against my collarbone, pinning me in place. "You listen to me, you pathetic little secretary," he snarled, spit flying from his lips. "You are going to keep your mouth shut. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I have connections in this city that could crush you before sunrise. I know the senior executives at your little corporate office, and I will make one phone call and ensure you never work in this town again. You are nothing but a bitter, lonely woman who is jealous of my massive success." I stared right through him. He was threatening my career while standing in a suit he bought with stolen money. He was threatening to call executives at a venture capital firm that I currently controlled. It was almost poetic in its sheer absurdity. Before I could tell him exactly who owned his massive debt, the heavy wooden doors at the end of the corridor swung open. My father Calvin and my mother Brenda walked into the quiet hallway. They had clearly come looking for their star son-in-law to celebrate his fake award. Calvin stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Trent pinning me against the wall. But my father did not rush forward to protect his own daughter. He did not pull the aggressive man away from me. Instead, his face twisted into a mask of pure fury, directed entirely at me. Trent immediately released his grip on my collarbone and stumbled backward, playing the role of the startled victim perfectly. He smoothed his tuxedo jacket and let out a dramatic, heavy sigh. "Calvin, I am so sorry," Trent stammered, putting his hands up in a defensive gesture. "Nadia followed me back here and started demanding money. She is completely hysterical. She started yelling about how unfair it is that Vanessa gets a new vacation home while she struggles to pay her rent. I tried to calm her down, but she just kept attacking me. It was a flawless lie delivered with total conviction, and my parents swallowed it whole." My father marched down the corridor, his heavy dress shoes thudding against the floor. He did not ask for my side of the story. He did not care that Trent had just physically assaulted me. He stopped right in front of me, his chest heaving with blind rage. "You are a disgrace to this family!" Calvin roared, his voice echoing down the empty hall. "We bring you to a prestigious event to celebrate a real visionary, and you act like a common street beggar. You are harassing my son-in-law on the biggest night of his career, because you are too lazy to build anything for yourself." "Dad, he is lying," I said, keeping my voice absolutely calm. "He is stealing your retirement money to flee the country with his mistress." The sharp crack of a hand hitting skin echoed loudly in the corridor. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow. A blinding sting radiated across my left cheek. My own father had just slapped me across the face to defend a white man who was actively robbing him blind. I stood completely still, the metallic taste of blood pooling in the corner of my mouth where my teeth had caught the inside of my cheek. I slowly turned my head back to look at them. "How dare you spread such vile, jealous lies about a man who provides for this family?" my mother screamed, stepping forward to stand next to my father. "You are sick, Nadia. You are deeply mentally disturbed. I am ashamed that I ever gave birth to you. You are no longer welcome in our home. You are no longer part of this family. Get out of our sight right now and never speak to us again." Trent stood behind them wearing a smug, victorious grin. He thought he had completely neutralized the threat. He thought he had turned my family against me so thoroughly that nothing I said would ever be believed. I slowly raised my hand and touched my stinging cheek. I wiped a small drop of blood from the corner of my mouth. I did not cry. I did not scream or beg for their love. The little girl who desperately wanted her parents' approval had officially died the second that hand struck my face. I looked at Calvin and Brenda with eyes so completely dead and void of emotion that my mother actually took a nervous step backward. I did not say a single word. I simply adjusted my simple black dress, turned my back on the three of them, and walked down the long corridor toward the exit. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the crisp night air of downtown Atlanta. The valet saw me approach and immediately ran to the private VIP lot. My parents and Trent thought I had taken a cheap rideshare to the gala. They had absolutely no idea what I really drove because I never brought it to their suburban house. A minute later, the valet pulled up in a pristine midnight black Mercedes Maybach. The polished exterior gleamed under the streetlights. It was a $500,000 masterpiece of automotive engineering that I paid for in cash 3 years ago. I tipped the valet a $100 bill and slid into the luxurious white leather interior. The cabin was perfectly silent, isolating me from the noise of the city. I sat behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel and pulled out my secure work phone. My cheek was still throbbing with intense heat, but my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. I opened my encrypted email application and drafted a new high-priority message to my lead corporate attorney and my senior asset liquidation team. I attached the audio recording of Trent's frantic phone call regarding the Sarah woman and his Cayman Islands getaway. I attached the forged financial disclosures he submitted to my venture capital firm. I attached the legal documents authorizing the aggressive buyout of all his existing corporate debt. In the body of the email, I typed exactly one word: execute. I hit send and put the massive luxury car in drive. My family wanted to worship a wealthy son-in-law and discard their administrative assistant daughter. By tomorrow morning, they were going to learn exactly what real wealth and absolute ruin looked like. Exactly 48 hours after I hit send, the financial guillotine finally dropped on my family. It was Wednesday afternoon, and the weather in Atlanta was exceptionally clear and bright. I was sitting at my desk watching the dominoes fall in real time through my corporate dashboard. The buyout of Trent's debt had been executed with ruthless efficiency. My firm now legally owned every single liability attached to his name. And because Trent had violated the terms of his commercial leases by defaulting for 6 consecutive months, we had the legal right to freeze his accounts and call in his collateral immediately. Across town at the exact same moment, my sister Vanessa was oblivious to the incoming storm. She was having lunch and shopping at Phipps Plaza with 3 of her wealthy country club friends. I knew this because she was broadcasting her entire luxurious afternoon on social media. She walked into a high-end designer boutique and picked out a limited edition leather handbag that cost more than a reliable used car. She casually handed her heavy metal black American Express card to the sales associate, laughing about some inside joke with her friends. The card machine beeped a harsh, loud tone of rejection. The sales associate frowned and ran the card again. Another loud beep echoed through the quiet boutique. "I am sorry, Mom, but this card has been declined," the associate said, her voice carrying perfectly across the silent store. Vanessa immediately turned red. Her friends stopped laughing and stared at her. She snatched the card back, insisting it was a stupid banking error and demanding they run her backup platinum card. That one was declined too. Then her debit card was rejected. Within 5 minutes, the manager had to ask her to step aside because she was holding up the line. Vanessa walked out of the boutique empty-handed and thoroughly humiliated while her friends whispered behind her back. While Vanessa was panicking at the mall, a different kind of disaster was unfolding in the financial district. Trent's boutique consulting firm occupied a premium corner suite in a high-rise building. At 2 in the afternoon, building security arrived with commercial locksmiths. Because my firm had purchased the building management debt, we executed an immediate lockout for non-payment of rent. The heavy glass doors to Trent's office were chained and padlocked. A bright orange legal notice was slapped across the glass, informing everyone that the premises had been seized by creditors. I sat in my office and listened to the aftermath unfold through a series of frantic voicemails left on my personal phone. I did not answer a single one of them. I just let them roll to voicemail and played them back one by one. The first message was from Vanessa. Her voice was trembling with panic. "Nadia, pick up the phone right now," she demanded. "My cards are not working. Every single account is frozen. I think our bank was hacked. I cannot get a hold of Trent and I am stranded at the mall. You need to wire me some cash immediately so I can pay for my valet and get out of here." The second voicemail came from my father, Calvin. He sounded breathless and confused. "Nadia, we have a serious problem," he said. "I went by Trent's office to drop off some paperwork and the doors are padlocked. There is some kind of massive clerical error happening. Trent is not answering his phone, and his car is not at his house. Your mother is worried sick. I know you work in administration, so call your bank and find out why this hold was placed on Trent's accounts. He must be stuck at the bank trying to sort out this massive misunderstanding." They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they still believed Trent was a victim of a banking glitch. They still trusted him implicitly. They had absolutely no idea that he had completely vanished. Trent was a coward who knew exactly what the frozen accounts and padlocked doors meant. He knew the game was over, and instead of facing the music, he had simply abandoned ship. I listened to a third voicemail, this one from my mother, Brenda. She was crying hysterically. "Nadia, please answer your phone," she sobbed. "We cannot find Trent anywhere. Calvin called the police, but they said he has not been missing long enough to file a report. This must be identity theft. Someone is targeting our family because Trent is so successful. Please use your office phone to call the fraud department. We need to help him. I deleted the voicemails and closed my laptop. I grabbed my coat and walked to the private elevator. The day was not quite over yet, and there was one final piece of business I needed to attend to personally. Vanessa had managed to get an Uber back to her neighborhood after her country club friends awkwardly made their excuses and abandoned her at the mall. She lived in a massive luxury mansion in an exclusive gated community. My parents always bragged to their friends that Trent had bought the house in cash. That was another lie. The house was a highly leveraged rental managed by a premier property group, and as of yesterday morning, that property management company was wholly owned by a holding firm that reported directly to me. I parked my Maybach down the street from Vanessa's driveway and watched through the tinted windows. The Uber pulled up and my sister stepped out looking completely disheveled. Her usual perfect posture was gone. She was desperately scrolling through her phone trying to call her missing husband. She walked up the long, winding driveway and climbed the stone steps to her grand front double doors. She reached out to open the door, but her hand stopped mid-air. Taped directly at eye level on the expensive frosted glass was a bright yellow legal document. It was a 24-hour notice of eviction. It stated clearly that due to 6 months of unpaid rent and fraudulent financial applications, the lease was immediately terminated. It demanded that all occupants vacate the premises by tomorrow afternoon or face forced removal by the county sheriff's department. I watched Vanessa rip the paper off the door. She read it once and then read it again, her knees physically buckling. She collapsed onto the front porch, clutching the eviction notice to her chest and sobbing uncontrollably. The illusion she had sacrificed everything to maintain was completely shattered. But the best part was something she would not realize until she read the very bottom of that legal document. Below the stark warnings and the aggressive legal jargon was the authorizing signature of the primary property owner. It was not signed by a faceless corporation or an anonymous bank manager. It was signed clearly and boldly by Nadia Marie Wilson. I watched Vanessa sobbing on the cold stone porch from the tinted windows of my car. For a brief second, a ghost of pity tried to surface, but I quickly crushed it. She had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, and now she was finally feeling the ground give way beneath her. I put the Maybach in drive and smoothly pulled away from the curb, leaving my sister to face the reality of her shattered illusion. My phone chimed softly against the leather console. It was a secure message from my corporate security director. While my family was running around the city in a blind panic, treating Trent like a missing victim, my team had been silently tracking the GPS signal on his prepaid burner phone. The encrypted coordinates showed a clear path heading straight south toward Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. More specifically, the signal was stationary at the exclusive first-class international lounge in Terminal F. I merged onto the highway, pressing the accelerator. Trent thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he was incredibly sloppy. He did not realize that a senior venture capital executive has access to former intelligence officers for corporate security. My team had easily bypassed his cheap burner phone encryption within minutes. He was relying on the chaotic energy of my parents and my sister to buy himself enough time to escape the country. He figured they would be too busy blaming me to actually look for him. I bypassed the main airport traffic and pulled into the VIP executive parking structure. Using my platinum corporate clearance, I breezed right through the expedited security checkpoint without breaking my stride. The International First Class Lounge was a quiet sanctuary of polished wood and dim lighting far removed from the noise of the regular terminal. I walked past the velvet ropes and immediately spotted him. Trent was sitting in a plush leather corner booth sipping a glass of champagne. Sitting right next to him was a young blonde woman looking nervously at her phone, Sarah, the mistress. She had a designer tote bag resting on her lap and looked like she was ready to bolt at the slightest sign of trouble. Trent looked up and our eyes locked across the quiet room. For a split second, the glass of champagne in his hand trembled. The color completely drained from his face as he realized I had tracked him down. But Trent was a narcissist to his very core. He quickly swallowed his panic and forced that familiar arrogant smirk onto his face as I calmly walked over to his table. He leaned back against the leather booth and draped his arm around Sarah, acting like a man who had already won the ultimate prize. "You are incredibly persistent, Nadia," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I will give you that. But you are way too late. You can stand there looking angry all you want, but you cannot stop me from getting on that plane. The offshore accounts are completely secure, and the wire transfers are already cleared." I did not raise my voice. I simply signaled the lounge bartender and ordered a double espresso. I stood perfectly still waiting for my drink while Trent continued to gloat. He could not resist the urge to brag about his brilliant deception. "Do you want to know the best part, Nadia?" he sneered, leaning closer across the small table. "Your parents practically begged me to take their money. $2 million of their precious retirement funds liquidated and handed right over to me. They were so desperate to impress their country club friends with my fake hedge fund portfolio that they signed the authorization papers without even reading the fine print. They are the most status-obsessed, gullible fools I have ever met. They cared more about showing off their successful white son-in-law than they ever cared about their own flesh and blood. They practically handed me the keys to their entire life just to prove how elite they were. I did not even have to try that hard, Nadia. They wanted to believe the lie because the truth about their own mediocrity was just too painful to accept." The bartender set my espresso on the marble counter. I picked up the small porcelain cup, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers. Trent was absolutely right about my parents. They had traded their own daughter for a cheap illusion of prestige. They had validated his disrespect, ignored his obvious financial red flags, and slapped me across the face to protect his fragile ego. They had built their own trap, and Trent had simply locked the door. For 32 years, they had made me the villain of their story. Now they were finally going to meet the real monster they had invited into their home. "You think you are so smart with your corporate title and your expensive suits?" Trent laughed, taking another sip of his champagne. "But your entire family is broke. Vanessa is probably crying in the street right now, and your parents are going to be working at a grocery store to pay off their reverse mortgages. And I am going to be sitting on a private beach in the Cayman Islands, drinking expensive rum. So go ahead and run back to your parents and tell them the golden boy took everything. There is absolutely nothing you can do about it now." He stood up, adjusting his tailored jacket, and grabbed his leather carry-on bag. He looked at Sarah and told her to grab her purse because their flight to paradise was calling for first-class boarding. He actually puffed out his chest, looking down at me as if I were nothing more than an annoying insect he had finally swatted away. He fully expected me to scream or beg or throw a desperate fit right there in the quiet lounge. He wanted a reaction to feed his massive, fragile ego. He wanted me to cry over my parents' lost money. I took a slow, delicate sip of my espresso, letting the rich, bitter taste wash over my tongue. I looked at Trent and let a genuine calm smile spread across my face. "Have a nice flight, Trent," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and relaxed. "I hope you like the welcoming committee." The morning sun reflected off the sleek glass skyscrapers of Buckhead as I sat at my massive mahogany desk. It was barely 9 in the morning, and my phone was already vibrating off the hook with panicked messages. I ignored every single one of them. Trent was currently sitting in a federal holding cell thanks to the anonymous tip I provided to airport security right after I walked away from the first-class lounge. But my family did not know that yet. They only knew that Trent was missing. Their bank accounts were locked, and Vanessa had a 24-hour eviction notice taped to her front door. They were in absolute chaos, and their first instinct was to find a scapegoat to bail them out. At exactly 9:30, my office intercom buzzed. It was my head receptionist, Sarah, sounding slightly breathless and alarmed. I switched my primary monitor to the live security feed from the main lobby. The high-definition cameras captured my mother Brenda, my father Calvin, and my sister Vanessa storming through the automatic sliding glass doors of my venture capital firm. They looked like absolute wrecks. The polished, serene environment of the ultra-modern lobby was immediately disrupted by their frantic energy. Vanessa was wearing huge dark sunglasses to hide her puffy eyes and clutching her useless designer handbag like a life preserver. My father was red in the face, marching past the security turnstiles with total disregard for the building protocols. I turned up the audio feed on my monitor so I could hear every word. My father slapped his heavy hand down on the sleek marble reception desk, startling Sarah. "We are looking for Nadia," he barked, his voice echoing harshly through the quiet, elegant lobby. "We know she works here as a junior analyst or whatever it is she does. Call her down here immediately because we have a family emergency and she needs to sign some paperwork to release her funds." Vanessa started sobbing loudly right there in the lobby, wiping her nose with a tissue and leaning dramatically against the marble counter. "She needs to drain her retirement accounts right now," Vanessa whined, her voice carrying across the entire floor. "Trent is just dealing with a temporary cash flow issue, and I am being evicted from my house. Nadia has to fix this because she has no overhead. She just sits in her little cubicle all day with no real responsibilities. Mom told her she has to step up and help the family since she does not have a husband of her own to take care of." Sarah politely asked them to lower their voices and requested their identification. My mother, Brenda, completely lost her temper. She stepped forward and slammed her own hand on the desk, demanding to know if Sarah had any idea who they were. "We are an elite family in this city, and we do not have time to wait in your waiting room," Brenda snapped, leaning over the counter and pointing a manicured finger right at the receptionist. "Stop typing on your little computer and fetch my daughter before I have your manager fire you. She is just a low-level employee, so she has to do what we tell her." My father chimed in, nodding his head in aggressive agreement. "She owes this family," Calvin declared loudly. "I am not leaving this building until she transfers her 401k into my account, so I can save my other daughter's home. Go get her right now." Sarah maintained her perfect professional composure. She looked at her computer screen and then looked back up at my furious parents. She did not flinch under their arrogant glaring. "I am very sorry, sir," she said calmly, looking directly at my father. "But you must have the wrong department, or perhaps the wrong building entirely. We do not have a junior analyst named Nadia working here." My father let out a harsh, bitter laugh, telling her not to lie to him. "I know she works here," he growled, leaning closer. "She has been pushing paper at this firm for 5 years. Tell her that Calvin and Brenda are here and we are not leaving until she hands over that money." Sarah shook her head and folded her hands neatly on the desk. "I am not lying to you, sir," she replied, her voice perfectly even and polite. "We do not have a junior analyst named Nadia. We only have our senior vice president." My parents and sister froze completely, entirely paralyzed by the words. The statement hung in the air, completely incomprehensible to their arrogant minds. They simply could not process what the receptionist had just said. They looked at each other in utter confusion, as if Sarah had started speaking a foreign language. The silence in the lobby was deafening. I decided they had waited long enough. I stood up from my desk and walked toward the private corridor that led directly to the executive boardroom overlooking the main lobby. I was wearing a bespoke charcoal gray suit that cost $5,000, tailored to absolute perfection. It was the armor of a woman who controlled millions of dollars in corporate debt. I motioned for my 2 lead corporate attorneys and my head of personal security to follow me. We stepped into the boardroom and I approached the balcony edge. The heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom slid open with a soft mechanical hum. The sudden noise made my parents and Vanessa turn around and look up. I stood at the top of the marble staircase, looking down at the 3 people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. I was flanked by 2 ruthless lawyers in custom suits and a massive security guard. I exuded pure, terrifying power. The shock on their faces was absolute. Their jaws literally dropped as they stared up at me, realizing in real time that the bitter corporate drone they had mocked was actually the person who held their entire lives in her hands. I did not raise my voice, but the perfect acoustics of the lobby carried my words effortlessly down to where they stood. "Bring them in," I ordered. The heavy frosted glass doors slid shut behind them with a soft click. My lead security officer, Marcus, stood firmly by the exit while my 2 senior attorneys took their seats on either side of me. The executive boardroom was a massive expanse of dark mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling Atlanta skyline. Calvin, Brenda, and Vanessa stood at the opposite end of the long, polished table, looking completely out of place in this environment of high finance and corporate power. Vanessa kept her oversized designer sunglasses on her face, but her hands were visibly shaking as she clutched her useless leather bag. My mother, Brenda, looked around the opulent room with wide, nervous eyes, trying to process the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding us. But my father, Calvin, quickly recovered his false sense of suburban superiority. He marched up to the table and slapped his thick palms flat against the wood, attempting to assert his usual patriarchal dominance over me. "Stop playing these ridiculous games, Nadia," my father ordered, his voice echoing harshly in the large acoustic space. "I do not care whose office you broke into or what kind of fake authority you are trying to project today to impress us. We are dealing with a real family crisis right now, and you are going to sit down and listen to me. Trent has experienced a minor banking error, and Vanessa's landlord is trying to unlawfully evict her from her home. You are going to log into your retirement accounts right now and transfer your entire savings to your sister to cover her expenses. You owe this family your absolute loyalty, and we are not leaving this building until you sign the necessary wire transfer forms." Brenda nodded vigorously behind him, stepping forward to back up his aggressive demands. She crossed her arms and told me it was my duty as the unmarried sister to sacrifice my small life for Vanessa's important marriage. She said I had no real overhead and no real responsibilities, so I needed to empty my 401k to protect the family image. I did not blink or react to their absurd demands. I simply reached forward and opened the first black leather portfolio resting on the table. I slid a thick stack of heavy legal documents across the smooth mahogany surface until they stopped right in front of my father. "I am not playing games, Calvin," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. "And I am certainly not a junior analyst. I am the senior vice president of this venture capital firm. You are currently standing in my building. I advise you to look very closely at those papers. They are the official acquisition records for every single piece of commercial debt attached to your precious son-in-law." Calvin slowly picked up the papers, his eyes scanning the dense legal text and the undeniable corporate seals. I watched his confident posture begin to physically crumble as he read the staggering numbers and realized the absolute truth. "Trent is completely bankrupt," I explained to the silent room, while my father stared at the pages in horror. "He defaulted on all of his commercial leases, and he falsified his loan applications to secure more funding. My firm bought out his debt 48 hours ago. We padlocked his office doors and we froze every single one of his accounts. Your golden boy is a total fraud who built his entire fake empire on predatory credit lines that I now legally control." "That is a complete lie," Vanessa screamed, finally pulling off her dark sunglasses to reveal her mascara-stained cheeks and bloodshot eyes. "Trent is a millionaire and a respected innovator. He bought my luxury home in cash, and he is going to fix this entire mess the minute his phone turns back on. You are just making this up because you have always been deeply jealous of my perfect life and my beautiful marriage." I did not raise my voice to argue with her delusion. I calmly opened the second black leather portfolio and removed a single sheet of premium watermarked paper. I pushed it down the long table toward her. It was the master deed and the corporate acquisition record for her gated community rental property. "Trent did not buy your mansion, Vanessa," I stated, watching her eyes widen in pure terror as she read the property address on the official deed. "He was renting it through a corporate management group that he stopped paying 6 months ago. As part of our debt consolidation strategy, my holding firm acquired that specific property management group yesterday morning. I am your new landlord, Vanessa. And because your husband is a defaulting fraud, I authorize the immediate termination of your lease. That eviction notice on your front door is completely legal, and you have less than 12 hours to remove your belongings before the county sheriffs arrive to escort you off my property." The arrogant bluster completely evaporated from the room, leaving behind a heavy, toxic silence. A suffocating dread settled over my parents as the terrifying reality of their situation finally set in. Brenda reached out and gripped the edge of the table, her face turning a sickly shade of gray as she struggled to breathe. Calvin dropped the debt portfolios, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he looked from the damning papers to me and back again. They were completely trapped. The daughter they had mocked, abused, and discarded was now holding the absolute power to systematically destroy their entire false reality. They had nothing left to say because the paperwork was undeniable and final. Vanessa suddenly snapped, slamming her hands against the mahogany wood in a blind, desperate rage. "You cannot do this to us!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "Trent is going to come back and he is going to hire the best lawyers in the country. He is going to sue you for everything you have, Nadia. He is going to destroy your career and make you pay for ruining our lives. You just wait until Trent finds out what you did." I did not stop her from yelling or try to calm her down. I simply picked up the small silver remote control resting next to my espresso cup. I pressed a single button connecting my device to the boardroom's hidden surround sound system. The rich, crystal-clear audio filled the entire room, instantly drowning out my sister's pathetic threats. Trent's panicked, frantic voice echoed off the walls exactly as I had recorded it outside the gala restrooms. "I am liquidating Calvin and Brenda's entire retirement portfolio," Trent's recorded voice announced to the horrified room, his cruel laughter cutting through the silence. "Vanessa suspects absolutely nothing because she is a clueless gold digger. I will be out of this miserable city and away from these pathetic, gullible people before they even realize their bank accounts are completely empty." I took a slow sip of my coffee and watched their entire world burn to the ground. The rich audio of Trent's voice faded into the high ceilings of the boardroom, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing down on our chests. I watched the exact moment my sister's reality finally shattered. The rigid posture she had maintained for her entire life simply gave way. Vanessa's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the plush carpet right in the middle of the imposing room. She was crying for her house. She was crying for her status. She was crying for the illusion she had spent 30 years building. The golden child was reduced to a weeping mess on the floor of my firm. Her heavy sobs echoed against the mahogany walls, filling the space with the sound of pure defeat. She kept repeating that it was a lie, that it had to be a mistake, that Trent loved her and would never leave her like this. Her designer sunglasses lay discarded near my polished shoes, but I did not step back. I just watched her unravel. My mother immediately dropped to her knees beside her favorite daughter. Brenda wrapped her arms around Vanessa's trembling shoulders and began stroking her blonde hair. Brenda was murmuring soft reassurances, trying to piece back together a shattered porcelain doll. She was trying to comfort Vanessa, but her own eyes were wide with pure terror as she looked up at me. She finally realized that every single thing I had warned them about was true. The man they had worshipped had left them with absolutely nothing. Brenda pulled Vanessa closer, rocking her back and forth on the floor of the boardroom like a frightened child. But my father did not look at his crying daughter on the floor. Calvin did not drop to his knees to comfort the child he had always protected. His face turned a deep shade of crimson as the panic mutated into raw, blinding anger. He slammed his fist onto the boardroom table, making the leather portfolios jump. He demanded to know where Trent was right that very second. He said he did not care about the house or the eviction or the fake portfolios. He only cared about his retirement funds. He yelled that he needed to get to the airport and drag Trent off that plane with his own bare hands. He ordered me to use my security team to stop the flight immediately. He demanded that I call the police and get his $2 million back before Trent vanished over international waters. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving with desperate rage. I set my porcelain espresso cup down on the polished table. The soft clink sounded like a gavel falling in a courtroom. I looked directly into my father's furious, desperate eyes. I told him he was wasting his breath and his anger. I told him Trent never made it to the Cayman Islands. He did not make it onto the private jet. He did not even make it out of the international terminal. Calvin froze, his mouth hanging slightly open as he stared at me. I explained that I had already taken care of Trent before I even walked into the office this morning. I told my father that while he and Brenda were busy screaming at my receptionist, I was busy making a phone call to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had provided the federal agents with a complete dossier of Trent's wire fraud, his offshore shell companies, and his exact coordinates in the first-class lounge. My security director had watched the entire thing unfold on the airport cameras. Federal agents had swarmed the lounge and arrested Trent right on the tarmac. He was currently sitting in a federal holding cell wearing handcuffs, while Sarah the mistress was being questioned in a separate room. Trent was facing decades in federal prison, and he was never coming back to save them. For a brief second, a look of profound relief washed over my father's face. He actually smiled, thinking that the nightmare was over. He puffed out his chest and said that was good news because now the authorities would force Trent to return his $2 million. He said he would hire a lawyer this afternoon to claim his money back from the federal agents. He actually looked arrogant again for just a fraction of a second. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool mahogany table. I looked at the man who had slapped me across the face just days ago to protect a criminal. I wanted him to feel the exact weight of his own foolish decisions. I told him he was not getting a single penny back. The money is gone, Calvin. The money is truly gone. The money is locked away forever. I explained that Trent had deliberately layered the stolen funds through a complex web of offshore shell corporations and fake international charities. Because the federal government was now involved, every single cent was frozen as federal evidence. I told him it would take teams of forensic accountants years to untangle the mess. It would take years of endless litigation. It would take hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees just to file a basic claim. Fees that my parents could no longer afford because they had willingly liquidated their entire life savings to give to a con artist. There was no safety net left for them. The realization hit my father like a physical blow to the chest. He stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of a heavy leather boardroom chair. He collapsed into the seat, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked at Brenda, who was still sitting on the floor holding a sobbing Vanessa. He looked at the massive windows overlooking the city. Then he looked at me. He looked at the daughter he had belittled his entire life. He looked at the woman he had physically struck to defend his own foolish pride. His shoulders slumped, and all the arrogant fire completely drained out of his eyes. He looked small and old and entirely broken. His hands shook as he gripped the armrests of the leather chair. His voice trembled violently as he finally spoke into the quiet room. "Nadia, what are we going to do?" I let his desperate question hang in the cold air of the boardroom. "Nadia, what are we going to do?" The words echoed against the heavy glass walls, sounding so incredibly weak, coming from a man who had spent his entire life commanding absolute obedience. My father was looking at me not as a patriarch, but as a beggar. Brenda scrambled up from the floor, leaving Vanessa sobbing in a crumpled heap on the plush carpet. My mother rushed to the edge of the mahogany table, her eyes wide and pleading. She reached out her trembling hands as if she wanted to grab mine, but the intimidating presence of my security guard stopped her dead in her tracks. "Please, Nadia," Brenda cried, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. "You have to help us. We are your family. We are your own flesh and blood. You are a senior vice president at this massive firm, so you clearly have the money to fix this disaster. You cannot just stand there and let your parents lose everything. You cannot let your sister go homeless. Blood is thicker than water, Nadia. We raised you. We gave you everything. You owe us your help." I looked at my mother and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no obligation. The emotional manipulation that used to control me was completely useless now. I stood at the head of the table and leaned forward, resting my palms on the smooth wood. "Blood," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue with quiet disgust. "You want to talk about blood now, Brenda? That is fascinating because blood did not seem to matter when I graduated top of my class with my master's degree, and you both skipped my celebration dinner because Trent wanted to show off his newly leased sports car at the country club." Family did not seem to matter when I bought my first investment property, and you told your friends I just got a lucky break while you praised Trent for being a financial genius when he was actually stealing your retirement money to pay for his mistress. I walked slowly down the side of the table, my tailored suit brushing against the heavy leather chairs. Calvin could not even look me in the eye. He stared down at his shaking hands, while his entire reality crumbled around him. You never cared about family, I continued, my voice echoing with icy precision. You only cared about status. You were so desperate to impress your elite social circle that you practically threw yourselves at Trent. He was the perfect country club accessory, a smooth-talking white man with a fake hedge fund and a bespoke designer suit. His whiteness and his perceived wealth gave you the validation you always craved. You wanted to parade him around as your wealthy golden son-in-law so badly that you completely ignored every single glaring red flag. You chose his illusions over my actual hard work. You let him disrespect me in my own home. You let him mock my career while I was the one secretly building an empire and he was the one robbing you blind. Vanessa wailed loudly from the floor, burying her face in her hands. Her massive diamond engagement ring glinted under the boardroom lights, but even she knew it was probably made of cubic zirconia. She was finally realizing that her entire identity as the superior sister was a total sham. Her perfect life was funded by crime and debt. And then there was last week, I said, stopping right next to my father's chair. I looked down at him. I raised my hand and gently touched my own cheek, right where he had struck me. I tried to warn you, Calvin. I stood in your living room and tried to save you from a federal wire fraud investigation. And instead of listening to your own daughter, you slapped me across the face. You struck me to defend a man who was actively draining your bank accounts to run away to the Cayman Islands. That physical slap broke the very last string tying me to this family. You made your choice that night, both of you did. My father buried his face in his rough hands. A dry, ragged sob tore from his throat. He was completely defeated. He knew every word I said was the absolute truth. Brenda was weeping openly now, mascara running down her cheeks, ruining her expensive foundation. They were stripped of their pride, their money, and their dignity. They had nothing left but the terrifying reality of their own actions. Trent did not just steal your money, Calvin, I said, returning to the head of the table. He used your personal accounts to funnel illegal wire transfers to his offshore shell companies. That makes you an accessory to federal wire fraud. When the federal authorities finish auditing his fake hedge fund, they are going to come looking for the tax liabilities on that stolen $2 million. You are not just bankrupt. You are facing massive federal tax penalties and potential prison time. Brenda gasped, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. She begged me to save them. She promised they would do anything I wanted. She swore they would change and treat me with the respect I deserved. She pleaded with me not to let them go to jail or end up living on the streets with nothing. I stood in silence, letting them stew in their absolute panic for a full minute. I watched them break down completely, shedding the last remnants of their toxic arrogance. Then I nodded to my lead attorney. I am not going to let you go to federal prison, I said calmly. And I am not going to let you freeze on the streets. But I am not doing it because we are family. I am doing it because I refuse to let the media associate my corporate reputation with your pathetic criminal negligence. My lawyer opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slid them precisely down the center of the mahogany table until they rested directly between my weeping parents. I will pay off your federal tax liabilities, I announced, my voice devoid of any warmth. And I will purchase a small, modest condo in a working-class neighborhood where you and Vanessa can live. But it is not a gift. It is a bailout, and it comes with brutal terms. That contract strips you of any remaining assets. It gives me full power of attorney over your financial estate, and it strictly forbids you from ever contacting me at this firm again. You will sign it right now, or I will let the federal government take whatever you have left. My lead attorney slid the heavy stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany table until they rested directly in front of my father. The thick white pages looked stark against the dark wood. I watched Calvin stare down at the papers, as if they were covered in poison. I kept my voice perfectly flat and corporate as I outlined the exact conditions of their survival. The contract requires you to sign over any and all remaining legal rights to grandmother's trust, I explained, watching my mother's eyes widen in absolute shock. I know you have been siphoning money from her estate to fund Vanessa's lifestyle for years, but that ends today. The contract also requires you to completely relinquish your power of attorney to me immediately. You will no longer have access to any credit cards or hidden investment portfolios. Instead, you will receive a strict and very modest monthly allowance that I control entirely. You will buy groceries on a strict budget, and you will live exactly like the working-class people you have spent your entire lives mocking and stepping on. Calvin's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The sheer humiliation of submitting to the daughter he had always treated like garbage was finally too much for his fragile ego to handle. He slammed his heavy fist down on the table, making the water glasses rattle, and aggressively pushed the contract away. "I will never sign this," he spat, his voice shaking with a pathetic mix of unhinged rage and deep terror. "I am the head of this family, Nadia. I built our legacy from the ground up, and I will not be reduced to an employee begging for a weekly allowance from my own ungrateful daughter. I would rather figure this out myself than surrender my dignity and my control to you." I did not argue with his foolish pride. I did not raise my voice or try to convince him to take the only lifeline I was offering. I simply reached across the wide table and calmly pulled the thick stack of legal documents back toward me. I gathered the papers, neatly tapping the edges against the mahogany wood to align them perfectly. I treated his rejection as nothing more than a minor business inconvenience. "That is completely fine, Calvin," I said, my voice ice-cold and detached. "Have a wonderful time navigating federal court and fighting off your impending eviction notices all on your own." I looked past my father and nodded directly at my lead security officer. "Marcus, please escort these individuals out of my building immediately. If they resist, you are authorized to call the local authorities and have them physically removed for trespassing." Marcus stepped forward, his massive frame instantly casting an intimidating shadow over my parents. The heavy leather shoes of my security team squeaked against the polished floor as they moved in to forcibly remove my family from the executive boardroom. The illusion of control finally shattered into a million microscopic pieces. Brenda let out a guttural scream of absolute panic. She knew Calvin was choosing his worthless, stubborn pride over their actual physical survival. She lunged across the table, scratching the wood with her rings, and desperately snatched the contract right out of my hands. She grabbed a heavy silver pen from the center console and shoved it directly into my father's chest. "Sign the papers!" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the high acoustic ceilings. She was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face and completely ruining her expensive makeup. "Trent stole our money and the federal government is coming for us. We have absolutely nothing left in the bank. If you do not sign this right now, we are going to be sleeping on the cold streets tonight. Sign the damn papers." Calvin looked at his hysterical wife and then looked at the massive security guards closing in around them, ready to drag them to the elevators. He looked down at Vanessa, who was still weeping pathetically on the expensive carpet, completely unable to process the total destruction of her golden life. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving with total defeat. Broken and thoroughly humiliated, he took the silver pen from Brenda. His hand trembled so violently he could barely grip the smooth metal. He leaned over the polished mahogany table and slowly began to sign his name on the dotted lines, officially surrendering his entire life, his financial freedom and his massive ego over to me. Brenda snatched the pen from his trembling fingers the exact second he finished and hastily scribbled her own name next to his. She pushed the signed documents back across the table toward me, sobbing with a pathetic mixture of profound relief and absolute shame. They had sold their remaining pride just to avoid federal prison. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over the signed contracts. I had finally won the long war. The decades of emotional abuse, the constant unfair comparisons, the physical violence, and the outright financial theft, it was all officially over. They belonged to me now, and they would live by my rules for the rest of their lives. But just as my fingers closed securely around the legal paperwork, A loud commotion erupted in the reception area outside. We could hear someone shouting over the quiet hum of the office. The heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom suddenly burst open, hitting the side walls with a violent crash. Marcus immediately stepped forward, reaching inside his jacket to secure his weapon, but he froze when he saw who was standing in the doorway, breathless and furious. It was Lila. Lila stood in the doorway, breathing heavily with her arms crossed tightly over her expensive cashmere sweater. She was wearing her elite dance academy uniform, and her face was twisted into a scowl of pure teenage entitlement. She did not even look down at her mother, who was still trembling on the carpet. She just marched right up to the mahogany table and slapped her perfectly manicured hands down against the wood. She demanded to know why her premium rideshare account had been declined in front of her entire dance troupe. She yelled that all her friends were laughing at her because the driver told her the credit card was suspended for fraud and ordered her to get out of his luxury vehicle. She glared at me with the exact same condescending sneer her mother had perfected over the last 3 decades. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest and told me to fix her account right now. She called me a pathetic loser, just like her mother and grandmother always taught her. She said I was probably the one who messed up the family accounts because I was always so deeply jealous of their incredible wealth. She demanded that I hand over my corporate card so she could get a ride back to her luxury gated community before she missed her private ballet coaching. She was a carbon copy of Vanessa, a shallow vessel of unearned arrogance who truly believed the entire world existed simply to cater to her endless teenage tantrums. She actually stomped her foot on the floor, demanding that I hurry up and serve her. I glanced down at Vanessa, who was still slumped on the floor, unable to summon the breath to stop her daughter. My sister was completely paralyzed by the catastrophic shock of losing her entire fake empire. She just stared at Lila with wide, hollow eyes as tears cut fresh tracks through her ruined foundation. She knew exactly what was about to happen, but she was too incredibly weak to protect her child from the brutal reality of their situation. Calvin and Brenda were equally useless, just sitting in their heavy leather chairs, staring blankly at the signed contracts that officially stripped them of their dignity. They had nothing left to offer the spoiled princess demanding money in the middle of my boardroom. I did not raise my voice or react to her childish insults. I simply walked slowly around the large mahogany table until I was standing directly in front of my 14-year-old niece. I looked down at her, matching the chilling absolute calmness I use during hostile corporate takeovers. I told her to lower her pointing finger immediately because she was not in her fake mansion anymore. I told her she was standing in my building and she was going to listen very closely to how the real world actually worked. Her arrogant sneer faltered just a fraction as she looked around the imposing room and finally noticed the massive security guards blocking the heavy glass exit doors. I explained the concept of complete financial ruin to her, using harsh adult terms, because it was time someone finally told her the truth. I told her that her premium account was declined because the credit card was tied to a fraudulent bank account that no longer existed. I told her that her beloved father Trent was not a wealthy innovator or a tech genius, but a common thief who was currently sitting in a federal holding cell waiting to be stripped of his tailored suit and put into a bright orange jumpsuit. I watched the color rapidly drain from her youthful face as I explained that every single thing she owned was bought with stolen money. Her private dance lessons, her cashmere sweaters, her entire privileged existence was nothing but a massive criminal lie built on stolen credit. She started to shake her head violently, whispering that I was lying and that her daddy was incredibly rich. I told her that her daddy was completely bankrupt and the federal government was going to seize whatever pathetic scraps of cash they had left hidden away. I told her that her dance friends were laughing at her because they already knew she was a fraud. I explained that she was not going back to her luxury gated community tonight because I was her new landlord, and I had just evicted her entire family from the premises. I told her she would be moving into a tiny, cramped apartment in a neighborhood she used to make fun of, and she would be taking the public bus to a regular public school from now on. The golden bubble she had lived in her entire life had just violently burst right in her face. I reminded her of all the times she had mocked my practical car or my work clothes while spending money her father had stolen from other people. I reminded her how my parents used to laugh when she treated me like the hired help at family gatherings. The adults who were supposed to teach her respect had instead taught her how to be a cruel, arrogant bully. And now those same adults were sitting silently in the room, completely unable to save her from the consequences of their collective greed. Lila began to physically hyperventilate as the crushing weight of poverty suddenly became brutally real to her. She looked wildly at her mother, begging Vanessa to tell her it was a nightmare, but Vanessa just squeezed her eyes shut and sobbed louder. Lila turned back to me, her arrogant mask completely dissolved into raw teenage panic. She looked at me, finally realizing that the aunt she had mocked her whole life was now the only person holding all the power in the world. I did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. Instead, I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a long, slim velvet box and snapped it open right in front of her tear-filled eyes. Resting on the dark silk was the exact same Cartier emerald necklace Lila had deliberately broken at our Thanksgiving dinner last year. The heavy gold links and the sparkling green gemstone had been perfectly repaired. The heavy gold links and the sparkling green gemstone had been perfectly repaired. I held the velvet box out under the bright recessed lighting of the boardroom, allowing the massive central emerald to catch the light and practically glow against the dark silk lining. Lila stared at the piece of jewelry, her jaw trembling, as she recognized the exact necklace she had carelessly ripped from my neck during her little tantrum in my parents' dining room last November. She had laughed when it shattered, claiming it was just cheap costume jewelry, because someone like me could never afford real stones. Vanessa had even defended her that day, saying I should not wear fragile, cheap things around a playful teenager, and that I was overreacting to a harmless mistake. I lifted the heavy gold chain from the box, letting the flawless emerald dangle between my fingers. I watched my sister's eyes widen as she finally recognized the undeniable weight and clarity of the stones. I told them this was not a cheap imitation or a department store trinket. I told them it was a custom-commissioned vintage Cartier piece valued at exactly $120,000. Lila physically choked on her own breath, stumbling backward as the sheer monetary value registered in her panicked mind. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant teenager who had just stormed into my boardroom, demanding premium rideshare accounts and calling me a pathetic loser, was suddenly looking at a single piece of jewelry that was worth more than her father's fake hedge fund. She looked at her mother in horror, waiting for Vanessa to scream that it was a lie to protect her fragile worldview, but Vanessa could not speak. Vanessa was staring at the emerald, her greedy eyes tracing the flawless cut of the stone, finally understanding the sheer scale of the absolute wealth I possessed. "I did not buy this necklace to be flashy, Vanessa," I explained, my voice cutting through the heavy, toxic silence of the room. "I bought this piece exactly 3 years ago to commemorate a very specific professional milestone. I had just closed my very first $50 million venture capital funding round. I secured the backing of 3 major international banks and cemented my position as a senior partner at this firm. It was the proudest day of my entire life." I stepped closer to my sister, who was still kneeling on the plush carpet. I reminded her of that exact weekend. I had driven to our parents' house, bursting with pride, ready to share my massive achievement with the people who were supposed to love me. I had the signed contracts right there in my leather briefcase. But when I walked through the front door, no one even looked at me. The entire house was decorated with silver and gold balloons. Brenda had ordered a massive catered feast, and Calvin was popping expensive champagne. They were throwing a massive celebration because Trent had just leased a new sports car under his fake company name. I stood in the doorway holding the paperwork for a $50 million acquisition and watched my entire family toast to a man who was actively stealing their retirement funds. I watched Trent stand there with his smug smile soaking up the admiration of my parents while my own mother shoved me aside. Calvin was giving a speech about how Trent was a true visionary and how proud he was to have such a brilliant financial mind in the family. He practically worshipped the ground Trent walked on because Trent represented the elite country club status Calvin had chased his entire life. When I tried to quietly tell Brenda about my promotion, she actually rolled her eyes and shushed me. She told me to put my little work news away because I was trying to steal Trent's thunder and ruin his special day. She said I was always so desperately jealous of his incredible success and that I needed to learn my place in the family hierarchy. So I left the house that night, drove straight to the boutique, and bought this necklace. I continued watching the crushing realization wash over Vanessa's pale face. I paid for it in full with my own money. I bought it as a permanent physical reminder that I would never ever wait for this family to validate my worth again. Every time I felt the heavy weight of this gold against my collarbone, I remembered that I was completely self-made and completely untouchable. And when your spoiled, entitled daughter deliberately broke it at Thanksgiving because you raised her to believe she was inherently better than everyone else, I did not scream or cry. I did not even get angry, because I knew the absolute truth about your pathetic fake lives. I knew that while you were laughing at my broken necklace, your entire existence was bleeding dry. Vanessa looked up at me, her tear-stained face completely drained of color. The sheer magnitude of her monumental failure was finally crushing her. She was looking at a woman who could have easily saved her from absolute financial ruin if only she had shown a single ounce of basic human decency over the last 30 years. She was looking at the forgotten scapegoat who had secretly built an empire, while the cherished golden child had blindly married a ruthless con artist. Vanessa opened her mouth to beg, her lips trembling as she tried to form an apology that was decades too late. She wanted to say she was sorry. She wanted to play the victim one last time and appeal to our shared sisterhood. She wanted me to rescue her and her terrible daughter from the terrifying reality of poverty and the consequences of their own toxic arrogance. But I did not want her pathetic apologies. I did not want her manufactured tears, and I certainly did not want to hear another disrespectful word from her spoiled child. I looked down at the woman who had made my childhood a living nightmare. I looked at the niece who had treated me like garbage. Then I simply opened my fingers and let go of the heavy gold chain. The $120,000 necklace fell through the air, catching the bright boardroom lights one last time before it landed heavily right into Vanessa's lap. The thick gold links pooled against her ruined designer dress. "Take it to a pawn shop," I said, my voice completely dead and final. "It will cover your first and last month's rent at a budget apartment." Welcome to the flea market, Vanessa. The heavy gold chain pooled against the ruined fabric of Vanessa's designer dress, sitting there like a brilliant green anchor, weighing down her entire shattered reality. She did not move to pick it up right away. She just stared at the flawless emerald, as if it were a venomous snake, while her spoiled daughter Lila completely lost her mind. The 14-year-old girl dropped to her knees beside her mother, letting out a primal shriek of pure, undisguised terror. Lila was thrashing against the thick carpet, pounding her fists against the floor, as the terrifying truth of her new impoverished life finally crushed the breath out of her lungs. She demanded that her mother fix it, but Vanessa was completely empty. My sister slowly lifted her trembling hands and gathered the heavy gold necklace, pulling it tightly to her chest, like a physical shield against the poverty she was about to endure. She knew this was the absolute end of the line. There was no more negotiation and there was no more arrogant bluster. This was her severance package from the golden life she had built on my suffering. My parents watched the transaction with wide, hollow eyes, finally understanding the absolute finality of my words. Brenda slipped out of her expensive leather chair and actually crawled across the thick carpet toward where I stood. She reached out with shaking hands, grasping at the hem of my tailored trousers. She wept openly, her face a horrifying mask of smeared mascara and pure desperation. She begged me to reconsider. She pleaded with me to remember the good times we had shared when I was a little girl. She tried to invoke memories of family holidays and childhood birthdays, desperately searching for any remaining shred of emotional leverage she could use to manipulate me. She cried that they were old and fragile, and could not possibly survive the shame of living in a budget apartment while their friends at the country club laughed at them. Calvin did not crawl, but he slumped forward, burying his red face in his hands, sobbing loudly into the quiet expanse of the boardroom. The man who had ruled our family with an iron fist, the man who had slapped me just a week ago, was now crying like a helpless child. He begged me for mercy, whispering that he was sorry for everything he had ever done. But as I looked down at the pathetic weeping mess of my biological family, I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, aching void inside my chest where my desperate need for their approval used to live was completely gone. I was finally cured of the disease of wanting their love. I stepped back, pulling my trouser leg out of my mother's frantic grasp. I did not say another word to them. I simply raised my eyes and gave a single sharp nod to Marcus. My lead security officer did not hesitate. He signaled the 3 massive guards waiting by the frosted glass doors, and they moved into the room with ruthless corporate efficiency. They reached down and hauled my parents up by their arms, forcing them to stand on their own 2 feet. Another guard gripped Vanessa by the elbow, pulling her up while she blindly clutched the emerald necklace against her chest. Lila tried to fight the guard, but he simply corralled her forward, ignoring her pathetic teenage threats. They were herded together like frightened cattle right in the middle of my magnificent boardroom. Marcus calmly informed them that they were now permanently banned from the premises, and that any attempt to contact me would result in immediate arrest for trespassing. The heavy glass doors slid open and my family was marched out into the brilliant afternoon light of the main corporate bullpen. The entire floor of elite financial analysts, senior vice presidents, and wealthy corporate partners stopped what they were doing to watch the spectacle. The bullpen went completely silent except for the harsh sound of my mother's weeping and Lila's pathetic whining. These were the exact type of high society people my parents had spent their entire lives desperately trying to impress. Now those same people were staring at them with thinly veiled disgust as my security team Frog marched them past the glass-walled offices. Calvin kept his head bowed, staring at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the corporate elite. He was visibly shrinking under the heavy weight of their judgment, completely stripped of his arrogant patriarchal pride. Vanessa stumbled on her designer heels, her mascara-stained face hidden behind her hair. It was the ultimate public walk of shame, and they had to endure every agonizing second of it. As they reached the final bank of elevators, Brenda stopped and turned around. The security guard placed a firm hand on her back to push her forward, but she fought him just long enough to look back down the long, polished corridor. Our eyes met through the expanse of the busy office. Her face was twisted in absolute agony, and I watched her lips move silently as she mouthed the words, "I am sorry." I did not nod, and I did not blink. I simply turned my back on her and walked away. I moved toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows in my private office, looking out over the sprawling, magnificent skyline of Atlanta. I took a deep, slow breath, feeling the incredible weight of my absolute freedom. Just as the elevator doors finally closed on my shattered family, a loud collective gasp echoed through the bullpen behind me. I turned around to see dozens of my analysts and partners pointing up at the massive flat-screen televisions mounted on the walls. The financial news network had just broken into their regular afternoon broadcasting with an urgent breaking news alert. A massive photograph of Trent standing on the country club golf course flashed across every single screen in the building. The bold red banner ticking across the bottom of the television read Local Entrepreneur of the Year, indicted in multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud sweep. The news anchor announced that federal agents had just seized his assets and detained him at the international airport. The ultimate public humiliation of my family had officially begun. The news of Trent's arrest swept through the elite circles of Atlanta high society faster than a raging wildfire. By the time I returned to my desk, my phone was already vibrating endlessly with notifications and frantic text messages from industry insiders. The massive federal indictment detailed exactly how Trent had systematically defrauded his investors using fake shell companies and falsified return statements. It was a spectacular and highly public downfall. Every major local news station was running aerial helicopter footage of federal agents carrying dozens of cardboard boxes out of Trent and Vanessa's massive suburban mansion. They were hauling away computers, files, and luxury assets right on live television. The illusion of their unlimited wealth was completely stripped away for the entire world to witness. Calvin and Brenda did not even make it back to their heavily mortgaged house before the social execution began. They were sitting in gridlocked traffic when the exclusive country club board of directors held an emergency vote to permanently revoke their membership. My father had spent 3 decades clawing his way into that prestigious circle, kissing up to the old money families, and pretending he truly belonged among them. He used to sit in the mahogany clubhouse dining room, smoking expensive imported cigars and bragging endlessly about his brilliant son-in-law. Now he was officially a pariah. A courier was dispatched immediately to hand-deliver a formal legal letter to their front door, demanding they return their club badges and clear out their personal lockers by the end of the day. Calvin tried desperately to call his regular golf buddies, begging for them to vouch for his character, but every single call went straight to voicemail. The board members my parents had considered their closest lifelong friends simply blocked their phone numbers and acted like they had never met them. Vanessa suffered an even more brutal and swift social death. She had spent her entire adult life ruling over a vicious clique of wealthy housewives who spent their days organizing charity galas and drinking expensive champagne at private luncheons. My sister had always been the loudest and most arrogant voice in the room, constantly showing off her designer bags and bragging about Trent's limitless success. She loved making other women feel small and inferior. But high society loyalty is incredibly fragile and entirely conditional. The moment the breaking news banners flashed across the screens detailing the massive wire fraud those same women turned on her like a pack of starving wolves, Vanessa actually tried to walk into her favorite upscale bistro later that week, hoping to find a sympathetic ear among her usual crowd. She walked past the hostess stand with her head held high, completely in denial about her new reality. But when she approached the large corner table, her friends simply stopped talking and stared at her with thinly veiled disgust. The women she used to gossip with openly turned their backs and refused to pull out a chair for her. One of them actually signaled the manager to have her removed from the dining area because her presence was causing a disturbance. They treated her like a contagious disease, completely erasing her from their elite social registry without a single ounce of hesitation. Vanessa was forced to walk out of the restaurant with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding that she was absolutely nothing without the stolen money backing her up. I watched the entire pathetic spectacle unfold from the quiet sanctuary of my executive office. My corporate communications team fielded hundreds of calls from probing journalists and investigative reporters, desperate for an exclusive statement from the successful sister of the disgraced socialite. I instructed my staff to issue a single generic press release stating that our firm had absolutely no financial ties to Trent's fraudulent business and that we would not be commenting on private family matters. I refused to answer my personal phone or engage in the chaotic media circus my parents were desperately trying to navigate. I simply stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling city and watched the family that had abused me completely self-destruct. They had traded genuine love and basic human decency for shallow social status, and now they were left with absolutely nothing. While my parents and sister were busy weeping over their shattered reputations and hiding from news cameras, I focused entirely on securing the one thing that actually mattered. I sat down with my lead attorneys and finalized the absolute transfer of my grandmother's trust fund. The contracts Calvin and Brenda had signed in my boardroom under extreme duress gave me complete legal authority over the generational wealth they had been quietly siphoning away for years. I moved every single remaining dollar into a highly protected offshore account that my parents could never access again. I spent hours auditing the financial damage they had caused, tracking exactly how much money Brenda had stolen to fund Vanessa's lavish lifestyle. It was sickening to see the ledgers proving they had drained an old woman's security to pay for luxury car leases and designer wardrobes. I locked the remaining funds behind an impenetrable wall of corporate legal protection, ensuring that the wealth my grandmother had built would be preserved for her actual medical care and intended purpose. My parents would never touch another dime of that money to maintain their pathetic facade. They were officially cut off from the only safety net they had left, and I made sure the banking institutions flagged any future attempts they made to access the credit lines. The dust was just beginning to settle on the absolute destruction of their lives when my private office phone rang late one evening. Most of my staff had already gone home for the night, and the building was incredibly quiet. I glanced at the caller identification screen and saw an unfamiliar automated system number flashing brightly. I picked up the heavy receiver and pressed it to my ear, expecting a late-night call from an international client regarding a pending merger. Instead, a cold mechanical voice announced that I was receiving a collect call from a federal holding facility. Before I could even fully process what was happening, the automated line clicked, and I heard the desperate, panicked breathing of the man who had ruined my family. It was Trent. The smooth, confident voice of the local entrepreneur of the year was completely gone. He sounded terrified and exhausted, his breath hitching wildly as he begged me not to hang up the phone. He told me he was sitting in a crowded, noisy holding cell, wearing a standard-issue uniform, and waiting for his initial federal bail hearing. He said Vanessa was useless and too busy crying to figure out how to help him, and Calvin was completely broke because the government had frozen all their associated accounts. He started sobbing into the receiver, pleading with me to hire a premium defense attorney to get him out of the terrifying federal facility. He actually had the absolute nerve to tell me that I had to pay his massive legal fees because I was the only person in the family who could afford to save him now. I listened to the pathetic sound of his heavy breathing echoing through the secured line. He actually expected me to save him. He truly believed his golden boy charm could manipulate me from inside a dirty federal holding cell. I did not immediately answer him. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the absolute desperation of his situation to sink deep into his thick skull. Trent. I finally said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any human sympathy. You are absolutely right about one thing. I am the only person left in this entire city who could possibly afford to hire the elite defense attorneys you need. I have the liquid capital to post your massive federal bail right this second. I could make one single phone call and have you sleeping in a luxury hotel bed tonight. I heard him let out a massive trembling sigh of relief. He started thanking me repeatedly, babbling about how he always knew I was the smart one in the family and how he would pay me back with massive interest once his assets were unfrozen. He promised me board seats on his future companies and swore he would make me richer than I already was. He was speaking so fast his words blurred together a pathetic stream of empty corporate promises from a man who had absolutely nothing left to offer. I cut him off completely. I am not going to make that phone call, Trent, I stated coldly. I am not going to give you a single dime of my money. I accepted this collect call for one reason only, and it was not to offer you a lifeline. It was to tell you exactly how I dismantled your entire pathetic life. He went completely silent on the other end of the line. The background noise of the federal facility seemed to fade away as I began my final explanation. I told him that I had known about his fraudulent shell companies for over 2 years. I explained how easy it was to trace his incredibly sloppy wire transfers and his poorly hidden offshore accounts. He thought he was a brilliant financial innovator, but he was just a careless amateur thief playing a dangerous game with stolen money. I detailed exactly how I had quietly secured my grandmother's trust fund while he was busy showing off his leased sports cars to my gullible father. I told him how I sat at every single family dinner listening to his boastful, arrogant speeches, knowing his entire life was a fragile house of cards. I audited his fake ledgers and mapped out his pathetic Ponzi scheme. I watched him dig his own grave week after week, and I did not lift a single finger to warn him when the federal investigators started circling his personal accounts. I outsmarted him at his own game by simply sitting back and letting his massive, incompetent ego destroy itself. Trent finally realized I was never going to save him. The smooth-talking entrepreneur vanished instantly, and a desperate cornered animal took over. His voice grew loud and erratic as he started screaming into the receiver. I could hear him slamming his fist against the wall of the prison phone booth. He resorted to throwing vile sexist insults, calling me a bitter, ugly spinster who was just desperately jealous of his beautiful wife. He used disgusting racial slurs and told me I would never be anything more than a glorified corporate drone working a miserable desk job, while real men like him built actual global empires. He screamed that he was Trent Blackwood and he would crush me the second he got out. I let him scream until his voice cracked and his breath ran completely out. I listened to him panting heavily into the plastic receiver like a beaten dog. I asked if he was quite finished, the icy chill in my tone echoing through the line. I told him that the single corporate drone he just insulted was the exact same woman who permanently ended his entire bloodline's financial future. You built your fake empire on stolen credit and overwhelming arrogance, and now you are going to spend the next 20 years rotting in a tiny concrete cell because you were too stupid to realize I was holding all the cards. You are not a visionary, Trent. You are just a common criminal, and you are exactly where you belong. He tried to shout something else, but I did not give him the satisfaction of a response. I pressed the red button on my desk phone and disconnected the line, instantly silencing his pathetic voice forever. I navigated into my phone settings and permanently blocked the Federal Holding Facility's incoming number, ensuring he could never reach me again for the rest of his miserable life. The quiet serenity of my executive office returned. I walked back toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the glittering city skyline as the evening traffic slowly crawled along the highways below. The soft ambient lighting of my office reflected against the glass, highlighting the calm, confident expression on my face. The long war was finally over, and I had emerged completely victorious. My biological family was entirely destitute, and the man who had enabled their worst behavior was locked away in a federal cage. My personal cell phone buzzed against the polished mahogany wood of my desk, breaking the peaceful silence. I picked it up and saw a new text message from my luxury real estate agent. I had instructed my agent to purchase Calvin and Brenda's foreclosed debt the second the bank seized their assets. I wanted to own the exact physical space where they had spent 30 years making me feel completely worthless. The message contained 3 high-resolution photographs of the massive suburban property. The images showed the house completely empty, stripped of all its expensive furniture and pretentious artwork. The perfectly manicured lawn was overgrown, and the heavy front doors were chained shut with thick metal padlocks. The sprawling estate where I had endured decades of emotional abuse and relentless mockery was now nothing more than a hollow, abandoned shell belonging entirely to me. The text below the photos was brief and entirely professional. The property has been fully cleared out, and the city permits have just been approved. The site is officially ready for demolition tomorrow morning. 6 months passed with the rapid efficiency of a perfectly executed corporate takeover. The suffocating summer heat of Atlanta gave way to a crisp and lucrative winter. I navigated my sleek black luxury sedan through the crowded parking lot of the upscale shopping mall where my sister used to spend her days burning through stolen money. I walked past the glittering storefronts and paused outside a high-end boutique. Through the pristine glass display window, I watched Vanessa folding cashmere sweaters. She was wearing a rigid, unflattering uniform and a plastic name tag pinned to her chest. Her perfectly manicured hands were raw, and her face looked aged and hollow. A wealthy customer snapped her fingers, pointing dismissively at a pile of discarded clothing. I recognized the customer immediately as one of Vanessa's former country club friends. The woman did not even make eye contact with my sister. Vanessa bowed her head and scrambled to clean up the mess, silently swallowing the exact same poison she used to feed everyone else. There was no more arrogant bluster and no more designer handbags. She was just another exhausted retail worker trapped in a miserable minimum wage shift, desperately trying to afford her basic utility bills. I turned away, feeling a deep, satisfying warmth spread through my chest, and walked back out into the brisk afternoon air. My parents' new reality was equally poetic and entirely deserved. Calvin and Brenda were currently living in a tiny two-bedroom condo on the absolute edge of the city limits. Their entire social lives were completely dead. They spent their days sitting in a cramped living room staring at a cheap television and aggressively budgeting their meager social security checks. Calvin had actually tried to apply for a mid-level management position at a local logistics firm, but his reputation was completely ruined. Nobody in the corporate world would hire a man closely associated with a massive federal wire fraud scandal. The country club elites had forgotten their names entirely. Lila was forced to enroll in the local overcrowded public high school. Her spoiled teenage entitlement was brutally crushed on her very first day when she realized nobody cared about her former zip code. She had to ride the yellow school bus and wear generic brand clothing completely stripped of the unearned luxury she had weaponized her entire life. They were all living the exact nightmare they had always believed was reserved for people beneath them. I drove my car away from the mall and navigated toward the sprawling suburban neighborhood where I grew up. I pulled up to the familiar double iron gates and stepped out onto the damp pavement. The massive brick colonial mansion that had stood as a monument to my father's toxic ego was completely gone. I had hired a premium demolition crew to tear the entire structure down to its bare foundation. I stood on the edge of the flattened dirt plot, breathing in the scent of overturned earth, an absolute victory. I had not just destroyed their physical house, I had erased their entire legacy. In its place, I had already commissioned an elite architectural firm to design a massive state-of-the-art community center and technology incubator specifically built to empower young Black women in Atlanta. The architectural renderings featured collaborative workspaces, advanced coding laboratories, and a sprawling mentorship wing. Every single brick and computer terminal was being funded directly by my grandmother's generational trust. The wealth they had tried to steal to fund their pathetic vanity was now going to build real empires for young women who possessed the exact same relentless drive that my parents had tried to beat out of me. It was the ultimate tribute to my grandmother's true legacy and the final nail in my family's coffin. I left the empty dirt lot behind and drove back toward the beating heart of the city. My private elevator whisked me up to the top floor of my new luxury penthouse. I stepped into the massive open-concept living space and walked directly toward the sprawling glass balcony. The stunning panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline stretched out before me, glittering like a sea of diamonds against the darkening twilight sky. The cold evening wind brushed against my skin, but I felt completely untouchable. I reached up and felt the cool, heavy weight of the exclusive Cartier necklace resting against my collarbone. It was a recent gift to myself, a brilliant gold reminder that I had survived the fire and forged my own absolute empire. My personal cell phone vibrated softly against the smooth surface of the marble patio table. I picked it up and saw an urgent high-priority email from my lead acquisitions director. The message confirmed that my firm had just successfully closed a massive multi-million-dollar merger that would completely dominate the regional market for the next decade. The wire transfers were completed and the contracts were permanently sealed. I locked the screen and set the phone back down. I picked up my delicate porcelain cup and took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark, rich espresso. The bitter, complex flavor bloomed across my tongue, perfectly matching the moment. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the crisp night air fill my lungs. The heavy, suffocating weight of my toxic family was completely gone, permanently erased from my reality. I opened my eyes and looked out over the glowing city, feeling the absolute, undisputed taste of freedom and sweet revenge. The most important lesson from this story is that your true worth is never defined by the toxic people who try to break you down even when they are your own family. Genuine strength comes from recognizing abusive environments and having the courage to walk away to build your success in silence. Sharing blood does not excuse manipulation or greed. Sometimes the ultimate justice is simply taking back your power, protecting your peace, and letting the consequences of their own actions catch up to them. If you have ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your peace, please share your experience in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering stories.